just started after the COVID or during the COVID-19 crisis. The racist murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis has been like a ignition, like a spark that ignited a movement of enormous proportions and lasting decades of accumulating discontent and even reaching insurrectionary levels in many cities. We have seen in a few weeks a wave of protests that have multiplied exponentially with nearly 1,400 cities and towns and suburban areas, but also all around the globe, showing that the fight against racism and police brutality has reached a new high, right? But we also think that this anger, even though it's connected with a long history of repression against the Black communities, and specifically how all the outcry of the Black community and allies against the police brutality have fallen in deaf ears of the capitalist system and its institutions. Since Ferguson, we have seen very little changes in any of the tactics of this militarization and almost occupation on the poor neighborhoods of this country. They are disproportionately people of color, especially immigrant communities and Black communities. But we also see another thing that is a little different to other expressions of this fight against racism, which is that we are amidst one of the worst economic crises and also social crisis that this system has seen in the last 200 years. The COVID-19 put on the surface and in sharp contrast for millions and millions of workers and youth here in the United States and in the rest of the world, that we are in a system that is collapsing, that is not able to put the humongous, the immense resources that we have, the wealth that we have for medicine, for PPE, for safe conditions of work, to have enough respirators, to have a solution for the millions and millions of people that are going into unemployment. Just only in the United States, in the last 2 months, we have 40 millions of unemployed claims. That definitely is showing more and more clearly what is the role of the state, what's the role of capitalism, and what is the future for us if we continue in this system. This, in our opinion, is one of the elements that have changed the situation dramatically, and in my opinion, for better, because what we see is a radicalization of the movement, a widespread of the movement that is reaching new layers of solidarity and sympathy for the communities of color and the struggle against police brutality. And we also see a sustainability of the actions, right? We are now in the week number 3 or 4, it depends how you count it, and we still see no signs to diminish, right? If any, the movement is taking a space and a breather to put some of the questions that are now in front of us, right? Where should we go from here? What are the methods that we need to use? Who are our allies? What is the role of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, et cetera, et cetera. But the energy is still there. The radicalism, the confrontation is there. And also any obstacle that the movement have to deal with, it has been dealt with determination and with increase in the radical forms of the struggle. For instance, when the police start repressing the mobilizations, there was more people on the street just to confront the police and stop the repression. There was more sympathy. There's some polls already that says that close to 66% of the population supports even not only the peaceful demonstrations, as they call it, but even those who have some kind of direct anger against property and the police. Meanwhile, the press and the politicians keep calling looting and violent demonstrations. But the reality is that most of the population, most of the working class in the United States, see with sympathy what is going on, because they are tired to hear the same, which is these problems are not changing. So as I say, as the new problems are coming up, the movement is resolving them. In places like Seattle or Minneapolis, there are already some initiatives that go a little beyond what we see so far in most of the the cities, including Madison. You know, there's elements of, for instance, in Seattle, there's a free zone where they try to have like elements of popular power, or people's power, people's control, showing a little bit the direction where this movement goes, which is no confidence in the system, no confidence in the institutions, and taking history in our own hands, not only by protesting and confronting the police, but also finding new ways to manage a society, which for us, the socialists, we think they are very good news, because this is exactly the same symptoms or the same indicators that we saw in other revolutionary processes all over the world in the last 200 years, which obviously the population or the working class and youth don't go to the conclusion of socialism and revolution from one day to another. But what we see is this escalation, this determination, this radicalization in content on the demands, but also on the acting. Clearly, if something is clear now, is that we are getting into this period of time where the working class and the youth are formulating a new way to struggle, and they're imagining new ways to, or new demands. And basically, these have two effects. One of them is that we see the status quo, the power, the capitalists not knowing what to do. On one side, you have the hardliners of capitalists with Donald Trump and company, who are trying to compel a part of the population, talking about order, talking about mobilizing the army or the National Guard against the protesters. Obviously, this is putting even more and on the surface the real problem, which is that we are in a society that is not democratic, and a society where it takes very little to challenge the status quo, to mobilize the National Guard and the military against us. But also we see attempts from the Democratic Party and the liberals to, at least on the lip service, saying that they are on our side, and they are going to do all possible to help us and do something. Things that we heard before, and that to a point sounds a little comical, because they don't have any way. They are not passing anything that is tremendously definitive or sustainable. And the little reforms they are trying to pass, like for instance, banning the neck chokes and other aspects or tactics of the police, are very limited in the scope, and it doesn't provide a solution to the real problems of the Black community, which start with the police brutality, but they don't stop there, right? So that's another question that we have in front of us, in front of the movement for the Black Lives Matters, the movement against police brutality, which is if neither of these parties are proposing anything, what should we build? What should we do next in order to change the things that we want to change? As the movement is moving forward, is flexing muscles, showing the not only the sympathy, but the energy accumulated to go out every night and every day, rallies everywhere, and all kinds of actions, and education, by the way, too. What we see is that little by little, the movement is sharpening or focusing into or working around one demand, which is defund the police. But obviously, this is happening in different ways in different cities, different pace also. So we cannot say there is a unified movement in the whole country asking for the same thing. And this, in a way, is opening the ability for some of the liberals, especially, but some of the politicians, to try to take the demand of defund the police and give it their own meaning, right? We saw that with the media, some attempts to reformulate, defund the police in terms of, well, it's just reimagining public safety, but without any content. We see also even proclamations from the Minneapolis City Council saying that they are willing to dismantle, but they are not saying how, when, or on which conditions, which it sounds a lot of what we see in movements related to police brutality and other movements, to be honest, in the past, which is lip service, but very little action behind it. So it definitely, even though the demand is there and it's very clear, it means different things for different people. In our opinion, from the international masses tendency, we see very clear that in this slogan, defund the police or abolish the police, when it's used by the working class and the youth, it means no confidence in the capitalist institutions, absolutely no justification to the violence of the state, and it means also a change from the root. No one trust to the promises of the liberals or the Democrats, but actually we want a solution from its root, which is removing the police. What it takes to do that is what we're going to discuss today, and from our perspective, in order what are the steps or the conditions that we need in the United States or in any other country in the world in order to abolish this machine of repression that is the police. Here in Madison, I think it's very clear that there is a movement that is definitely expressing all these aspects that we see in other cities in the nation. And I think that there's two things in Madison that are a little different to some other cities. One is we have a very good layer of activists and organizations that have been working on this issue for many years now, especially around the murdering of Tony Robinson in 2015. So we have Freedom Inc., for instance, leaders like Brandy Garrison and Urban Triage, and other organizations that have been working around bailing out people that right now of our community that right now they are in Dane County Jail just for the only crime to be poor, the only crime to be Black, the crime of be not a crime, but be victim of a over-racialized and classist justice system in Madison, Wisconsin. And so many of the actions that we see in Madison have been somehow rerouted to efforts that were already in place. But also another aspect that I think it makes Madison a very interesting point of departure for our conversation is that actually Wisconsin and Madison in particular is one of the worst places to be Black in the whole country. Just some data just to put in perspective. I'm sure our audience have seen and heard these numbers before. But right now, for instance, the Black community is about 7% of the population, and yet are 25% of the traffic citation in 2018. It constitutes also a 43% of arrests for Black juveniles. And then 46% of Dane County Jail, right? So disproportionately overrepresented the Black community and when it comes to persecution and repression from not only the police, but also the justice and justice system in the area. We also see in Madison schools in the last semesters, Blacks make 18% of the students, and yet they are the 57% of all out of the school suspensions. Similarly, most of the referrals to juvenile from the schools are for Black kids. So clearly there are structural issues or problems in Madison that despite of decades fighting against it and trying to change the needle a little bit, we still remarkably in one of the worst indicators in the nation. So goes with the achievement gap on the Madison School District. Black kids are arrested 7 times the rate of white kids, just to have another thing. And finally, and there's many other indicators where Black people fare very bad, and it's not Black people, but they are victims of a system that predominantly repressing and oppressing and exploiting the Black people in the city. Black unemployment rate is more than double than the unemployment of white people. So obviously this creates a lot of anger and it creates also a lot of impatience because what we see in front of all these problems here in Madison is pretty much a lot of talk and very little done. So we see also that the liberals in Madison, especially the politicians, are doing or trying to do what they have done always. Myself included. At one time, I was working in the fight against Sheriff Mahoney for sending information to ICE for undocumented workers, people that were detained many times without charges or charges with minor offenses. It was sent to ICE, and then obviously they were picked up for deportation. And I remember, and that was back in 2008 and 2009, that even though when the liberals were saying that they were wholehearted, sympathetic with our struggle, and that was not fair, absolutely nothing changed. They did all kinds of maneuvers to appeal that they were listening, and they did the tax fraud and the report yet again, and then at the end of the day, we still have the same problem today, and we couldn't really do anything. Now, however, the political class in Madison have a bigger problem, because the youth and the working class in Madison, they are in the rallies today. They have very clear they are not going to fall into the same trap. And that doesn't mean that our major incompetent, Rhodes Conway, actually has been trying to do this from day one, right? Is doing lip services, being very loud in her defense of Black Lives Matter movement, and yet secretly talking with the police and praising them, or sabotaging some of the ordinance or initiatives that it was to support some of the demands of the movement. And we say from here that this is normal. The liberals, the Democrats, and the Republicans are defending, at the end of the day, the same interest, the interest of the capitalist class, and they have absolutely no interest to give us this much of power. So coming back a little bit of the structure of the movement in Madison, the main demands that we are hearing right now is defund the police, which is concretely dismilitarize the police, also conduct or have a diverse approach to different crises instead of going first to the police. That includes services like for mental health, and other kind of services that can be and provided in advance before just sending armed people to deal with any crisis out there. But it also means eventually abolish the police or reduce it to a minimum expression. We also see the reparation for all Black people with programs to support youth and employment and education. We see another demand about release of the incarcerated Black people from jail, which makes sense, especially with the data and the percentage that I just gave before. Get the cops out of the schools, and also a community control over the police. Especially these two ones, these being items already on the table, on the different institutions. The Freedom Inc. Youth specifically has been working very hard in the last year to advocate to get the cops out of the schools. So therefore, there was already initiative in the Madison School District in this direction. And then on the community control, just some days ago, there was some movement to create a committee that will create another committee, basically to follow some of the recommendations of another committee. And this is unacceptable. The recommendations at the end of the day are around having an independent monitor civilian oversight board, and also a MPD, I think they call it independent monitor, and then a civilian oversight board. Sorry. So two measures to try to hold accountable police. But each step that this initiative is going forward is meeting with all opposition from the same liberal politicians that tell us that they support us, right? In this case, they make it very difficult that anything that's going to get out of that committee is going to have any teeth to control the police. And as Yvonne most surely is going to explain, this have a logic. They are more afraid that they lose the tool to control the population, and therefore they cannot protect the private property, which is what the police is for. So I think I'm going to finish with the following. we don't only see perhaps a split or a radicalization of the movement that it more clearly is looking at political expression that is outside the confines of the Democratic Party, and they are looking for the anti-systemic solution. Even the three organizations that are calling for the week of action last week start basically by saying that if there is no, the only way to eradicate capitalism is eradicate capitalism. Sorry, the only way to eradicate racism is eradicate capitalism. I think there is a very clear evidence that most people that are fighting against racism and for Black Lives Matter understand already that this is embodied in the capitalist system, that we need to fight against it. What we need to provide to this discussion, all the progressive forces in the movement, is where we go from here. What is the role of politics? What is the role of ideas? What is the role of classes? You know, at the same time that we have brave, coherent, and determined organizations in Madison to fight against police repression, like Urban Triage and Freedom Inc., we have organizations like the Boys and Girls Club that unhappily they just play once again the role to try to water down the movement. They were offering to hire 75 peace enforcers, which is pretty much expanding the police with people in the Black community, which is tremendously reactionary. But this it puts over the table that it is we cannot give for granted that everybody in the community or even the allies to the community, we are going to think the same, and that we need to have a deep discussion, a deep analysis of what is going to take to abolish police, what is going to take to finally have a program that gives a house, a job, education, and healthcare to every single poor immigrant or Black person in Dane County and in the whole nation, right? And our take, obviously, is that we need to fight for all these demands. We need to support all these movements, but also we need to fight for socialism, to remove the root of the cause of most of these issues. So hopefully that's a good introduction. Back to you, Liam.
Apologies, I just found out that my sound has been off.
You're totally fine. Thank you, Liam. Not a problem. I want to thank Liam for their introduction, and I want to thank Alex as well for his introduction to such an important discussion. For everybody that just joined us or has been watching since the beginning, you know, today's discussion is really meant to be a comradely contribution sort of to this larger public discourse that's taking place within the movement. And it's really an honor and a great responsibility to be talking about such an important topic today. Because all of the context that Alex laid out just before me, you know, when he talked about things like the rates of unemployment and the crisis of capitalism, the crisis in things like housing, I mean, these are also things that directly, disproportionately affect the African American community. As Alex said, it's not just a question of violence coming from your local police. And I think in these times, one of the most important things that we can do as Marxists is to listen, to reflect, and to learn where is the movement and where is it going? How can we help? As Alex said, the racist, terrorist murder of George Floyd was a spark that ignited a movement. It unleashed decades, many would say several hundred years of accumulated discontent, rather rage. When Alex talked about the local demands, for example, of releasing African Americans from jail he was talking about it also in the context, perhaps I don't have to remind many of you who are watching us today, that yesterday was the 48th anniversary of Nixon's declaration on the war on drugs, in the war on drugs, which has disproportionately affected Black and brown youth for decades, as well as yesterday was also the 5th anniversary of the Charleston Church Massacre, when Dylan Roof murdered 9 African Americans at Bible study, and where police arrested him without killing him, and even were able to take him to get a meal at Burger King. I think it's inevitable that these demonstrations that were ignited by the murder of George Floyd will leave a lasting imprint on the consciousness of ordinary workers and youth all around the country. And actually, as we saw with the massive demonstrations all around the world, I think it's leaving an imprint on the consciousness of masses of workers and youth all around the world. They're seeing that the masses of the United States, the working class of the United States, is not reactionary, is not just a bunch of sort of backwards people who will always follow the leader, but actually a revolutionary group of people. And while the Democrats, I think, in the mass media desperately try to co-opt the movement in order to move it into quote unquote safer channels, in part by telling us that one of the central demands of this movement, that has come out of this movement, that of defunding the police, doesn't really mean that. We can see through the movement for Black Lives, which has been, as Alex said, organizing around these issues for several years. They're very clear. They're saying, yes, it is. We mean what we say. And I think it's so exciting and important to really acknowledge the hard work that has been done by these organizations on the front lines in order to center, the experiences of the most marginalized people. And we saw it. We saw just the other day on Sunday, estimates of 15 to 40,000 people rallying just in Brooklyn for Black trans lives. As again, many people know, I sometimes feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I know a lot of you are much smarter than I am and know a lot of these things, but I think it's important to situate, where we are historically. Black transgender people bear not only a disproportionate burden of police violence, but they also face high rates of violence generally and street harassment, to the point that the American Medical Association just last fall said that the killing of transgender women of color in the United States amounted to an epidemic. So this movement isn't just coming out of nowhere, right? And at the same time, history shows us that all meaningful reforms are a byproduct of revolution or the threat of revolution. And that's what we've been seeing on the streets. And we can just take a look at what this movement has won so far, right? The Supreme Court of the United States, I think, feeling obligated, feeling the pressure to affirm the rights, the very basic human rights of the LGBTQIA and others community, their right to not be discriminated against in hiring, right, in the workplace, as well as just today, the announcement by the Supreme Court that Trump cannot just eliminate DACA, despite the fact that, of course, we recognize DACA is a very limited reform. I think this was still a really, really, really important win for the community. In addition, we've seen in several places bans on chokeholds, the toppling of Confederate statues, bus operators that are refusing to transport protesters on behalf of the police, the fact that the Louisville mayor suspended no-knock warrants, and the list goes on. And these reforms are wins, make no mistake. Each of them has to be celebrated. They're absolutely crucial. The fight against the daily threat of police violence, really the right to live, the right to breathe, is one of the most, if not the most basic democratic demand. And also, there's no capitalism without racism and a state apparatus. The movement for Black Lives has been very clear. There can be no liberation for anyone, especially the African American or Black community, under the current global racialized capitalist system. And to truly eliminate the police, we have to address the question of power. That is, which class holds political and economic power? That is key. The demand to defund the police is an immediate and urgent necessity, a demand from the movement that all socialists must fight for. And while we fight for that, we also simultaneously need to be talking about and expanding this demand, as well as other demands, to a mass struggle to form a workers' government incorporating the widest layers of the working class. As long as the ruling class is in power, all reforms will be in danger of being rolled back. And we saw this, history teaches. We've seen it with things like Jim Crow laws trying to roll back the gains that were made by the Reconstruction, by things like states' rights and the Southern Strategy by Richard Nixon and the Republican Party. This is a death by 1,000 cuts to all of the gains made by the heroic struggles that so many people, so many Black people have fought and died to win. The capitalist system of laws, as I just talked about, and those rollbacks are not the only tool that it has at its disposal, and not the only tool that's been used by the capitalist ruling class to maintain a division between the 1% and the rest of us. The capitalist class has consciously created all kinds of ways to divide the working class. For example, urban versus rural, white collar workers versus blue collar workers, women versus men, immigrants versus US-born workers, etc. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. However, I think today, one of the things that we really have to recognize is that the history of slavery in this country, the history of racism, makes that division based on race, specifically that division and rooted in anti-Blackness, one of the largest and most poisonous divisions within the US working class. In the early 1800s, one of the sort of well-known railroad magnates famously said that he could hire half of the working class to kill the other half. And this kind of divide and rule has been used by the capitalist class in the US since at least Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. The history of the police in this country, as well as every other capitalist country, is the protection of private property and the wealth of the capitalist class. In the US, police departments in the North grew out of armed strike-breaking forces employed by northern cities to control the immigrant working class. Often in the South, the police has its origin in slave patrols and colonial militias or quasi-militia outfits that were, aimed at suppressing slaves and eliminating entirely the Native American communities. And it's not just a question of your state or your local police, it's also a question of all of the other tools of repression that the capitalist class has at its disposal. ICE, Border Patrol, prison guards. The discussion has largely focused on the question of the local police, but the killing of Black people by those police forces is only one aspect of racist violence by law enforcement. The caging of Latino and Latina immigrant children, the intimidation of Muslim communities, the disproportionate violence that is carried out against Native Americans by various institutions all represent a nature of law enforcement within the nature itself of law enforcement, of police, of cops in a capitalist society. And capitalists are not going to give up this tool of repression so easily. Defunding the police is an important, urgent necessity. But the capitalists, if they can't have that tool, they'll use something else. They'll hire private militias. They'll try to use ICE. They'll try to use the Border Patrol. They'll try to use whatever it is. In order to stop the racist terror of the racist capitalist state, the working class needs its own political party. And it has to organize for its own self-defense. And this isn't some crazy idea coming out of nowhere. Every revolution in history has had to contend with these questions. As I mentioned before, the question of power, the question of self-defense. We've already seen inspiring, amazing examples of this in Minneapolis and in Seattle with the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Neighborhood self-defense committees are an essential part of this struggle. And what they've been able to accomplish so far, at least even in the ability to allow the rest of us to collectively imagine what something like that might look like, is beyond compare. And that's the beginning of what we as Marxists would call dual power, because it poses the question of who's really in control. And furthermore, I'm hoping all of you will join us at the end of the presentation, the public part on the Zoom, where we can have hopefully a really good, friendly discussion about where to go and what's going on. I'm sure so many of you out there are going to have excellent contributions and ideas about all of these topics. And the presentations by right now are not meant to be exhaustive in any way, shape, or form. Actually, we've tried as hard as we can to really focus our discussion, but there's of course so much more to be talking about. And regardless, I think of how long the current energy lasts on the streets, we know that one, people are not going to stop organizing for justice, just as there were so many really important and self-sacrificing organizations doing this work before the movement seemed to explode, right? It seemed for a lot of people to come out of nowhere, but we know that's not true. There will be people organizing after the movement isn't in the streets anymore. But we also know that there's going to be future explosions of the working class, that the working class instinctively tends towards solidarity and class unity, however imperfect an expression that may take. We've seen all of this in past revolutions. I think, taking it from the global to the local has been really important. Talking about what people can be doing in Madison, as Alex did, is one of the key takeaways today. Again, going back to that idea of like, how do we help? How do we support the movement that's taking place in the streets right now? And how do we take it further, right? And hopefully this has been a good contribution to the discussion. I'd like to end it here so that we have more time to really have a good discussion in the Zoom. And so I'm gonna turn it back over to Liam to give everybody the last minute instructions on how to join us in the Zoom and to continue this conversation. I really hope to see you. I really appreciate your time tonight, letting us talk a little bit about these issues, that you've spent it with us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Yvonne, for your presentation. I hope everybody can hear me now. I'm gonna go ahead and echo what you said, and I think a lot of things have been brought up tonight. So I really hope that you will join us at the Zoom to discuss this, and really everyone will get a chance to flesh it out. If these ideas resonate with you and you want to join us to fight for socialist revolution, I highly encourage you looking to join the IMT. We have links to our international, the National Center, and where you can sign up to join, and a link where you can subscribe. You can subscribe to our paper or donate to our branch in the description. So, yeah, if you want to go ahead and check out any of those resources, I am posting the link to the Zoom in the chat right now, so it is there. So, whenever you like, we can go ahead and migrate over. Everyone on the stream, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back again with another one of these soon, and take care.